The feast of redemption, the storm that had been brewing inside Sterling Hall, finally broke in a way no one could have predicted. It was not a scandal in the newspapers, nor a corporate collapse, nor even the open rebellion of the staff that undid the household silence. Instead, it was a single dinner, one more meal, one more gathering at the table, that carried the weight of every moment leading up to it. Lucas Sterling, proud and iron-willed, had called for the dinner himself. Weeks had passed since the confrontation in the library, and though his anger still burned, his instincts told him he had to reclaim control. Too many whispers were circling, too many investors looking at him with thinly veiled doubt. He had built his empire on the image of strength, and to preserve that image he needed to show the world that Sterling Hall was unbroken. So invitations were sent, menus planned, and the great hall prepared once more with polished silver, crystal glasses, and chandeliers gleaming like constellations. The guest list was smaller this time, but carefully chosen: a senator, two of his wealthiest investors, a philanthropist whose foundation held sway over public perception, and their spouses. Lucas prepared for the evening with the meticulousness of a general before battle. His suit was pressed, his words rehearsed. He would host with dignity, charm when needed, and authority always. He told himself that this dinner would erase the memory of the humiliation before, that it would silence the whispers and remind everyone why Lucas Sterling commanded respect. Yet beneath his polished exterior he was fraying. His daughter's words still haunted him. Better nothing than cruel. If you hurt her again, you'll lose me forever. They echoed in the empty spaces of the mansion at night, gnawed at him in the silence of his study, and unsettled him in ways he did not understand. When the guests arrived, the hall once again came alive with laughter, perfumes, and the low murmur of powerful voices. Yet the energy was different this time, lighter on the surface, but with an undercurrent of curiosity, even suspicion. The memory of that other dinner had not faded. It lingered in the minds of every guest who took their seat. They watched Lucas with polite smiles, but their eyes sought cracks in his composure. The courses were brought out with practiced grace. This time the food was prepared by the new chef Lucas had installed after Raldi's departure, dishes elaborate and pristine, each plate arranged like artwork. Yet as the guests tasted, there was little warmth in their expressions. The flavors were delicate but lifeless, the kind of meals that impressed in photographs but left the heart untouched. Clara sat quietly at her father's side, her fork moving without interest, her gaze drifting toward the door of the kitchen where she knew Maya was working in silence, kept away from the table by Lucas's stern command. Halfway through the dinner, as conversation turned to markets and policies, Clara suddenly placed her fork down with a faint clatter. The sound was soft but sharp enough to draw every eye at the table. She looked around at the guests, her face pale but her eyes steady, and then turned to her father. "I don't like this food," she said simply, her voice carrying farther than its volume should have allowed. The table froze. A senator's wife glanced nervously at Lucas. Another guest shifted in his seat. Lucas's jaw tightened. "Clara," he said, his voice low with warning, "this is neither the time nor place for such talk." Clara's chin lifted, trembling but unyielding. "I don't like it because it feels empty. Maya's food made me feel cared for. It tasted like love. This tastes like nothing." The words hung in the air, a child's truth slicing through the polished illusions of the evening. Lucas's face darkened, his fingers tightening on his glass. "Enough," he snapped. "You will not embarrass me again." But before he could continue, one of the guests, the philanthropist, leaned forward. He was a man known for his charities, his foundation feeding thousands through soup kitchens across the city. "Your daughter has a point, Sterling," he said, his tone curious rather than mocking. "Food isn't just about presentation. It's about connection. My wife often says the meals people remember most are the ones that remind them of home, of kindness." A murmur of agreement rippled around the table. The investors nodded politely. The senator's wife added with a smile, "Yes, there is something missing here." Lucas's pride bristled. He felt cornered, mocked again in his own hall. He opened his mouth to retort, but before he could speak, Clara rose from her seat, her small figure trembling but resolute. "If you want to taste something real," she said, her voice clear, "then Maya should cook for you. Not tonight, but another time. She makes food that matters." The silence that followed was deafening. Maya, who had entered quietly with a tray of wine, froze mid-step, every eye turning toward her. She felt her cheeks flush, her heart thunder in her chest. This was dangerous, too dangerous. But Clara's eyes pleaded with her, shining with a mix of defiance and hope. The philanthropist smiled faintly. "I would very much like that," he said. "There's value in food that carries history." Lucas's face was stone, his pride screaming for him to crush this rebellion. Yet even he could see the room tilting. The guests leaning toward his daughter's words, their curiosity piqued, their loyalties shifting. He forced a smile, brittle and cold. "Perhaps one day," he said, dismissing the suggestion with a wave of his hand. "But tonight let us return to business." The dinner resumed, but the energy had shifted. Conversations moved forward, but eyes returned again and again to Clara, to Maya, to the tension between father and daughter. Lucas could feel it, the power slipping, the storm breaking fully now in a way no wealth could contain. Later that night, when the guests had gone and the hall was silent once more, Lucas confronted Clara in the library. His voice was low, trembling with rage and something else, fear. "You humiliated me again," he said, his eyes burning. Clara stood before him, her small fists clenched, her eyes bright with tears she refused to shed. "I told the truth. If that humiliates you, then maybe you should think about why." His hand trembled, and for a moment Maya feared he would strike again, but then his arm dropped heavy at his side. The weight of her words, of all the words she had spoken, pressed down on him like a tide he could not hold back. For the first time in his life, Lucas Sterling looked at himself not through the eyes of rivals or allies, but through the eyes of his daughter, and he saw not strength but cruelty, not legacy but fear, not pride but emptiness. Maya stepped forward then, her voice quiet but firm. "It is not too late," she said. "You can still choose differently. Power does not have to be cruelty. Control does not have to be fear. She does not want your world because it has no kindness, but you can build something better if you will let yourself." The silence that followed was long, heavy, almost unbearable. Lucas stared at them both, maid and daughter, compassion and defiance. And for the first time he felt the walls he had built begin to crumble. His voice when it came was hoarse. "And if I don't know how?" Maya held his gaze steadily. "Then let her teach you." The days that followed were not transformed overnight. Cruelty and pride do not dissolve so easily. But a shift had begun. Lucas found himself watching Clara more closely, noticing the warmth in her laughter when she was with Maya, the ease with which she offered kindness to those the world overlooked. He began to taste the emptiness of the meals prepared by his new chef and, reluctantly at first, allowed Maya to cook once more. When he did, the house filled with aromas that softened even the marble walls. Smoke, spice, cornbread, greens simmered with love. For the first time in years, Lucas felt something stir in his chest that was not rage or ambition, but memory, faint and painful, of a boy who had once known hunger, who had once been fed by a mother's sacrifice. The final redemption came not in a grand announcement, but in a quiet dinner. The table was smaller, the guests fewer, the food simple but rich. Cornbread, greens, smoked turkey, beans cooked slowly to perfection. As they ate, conversation flowed easily. Laughter rose without cruelty, and even Lucas found himself speaking without the sharpness that had once defined him. Clara, seated proudly beside Maya, smiled more freely than she had in weeks, and for the first time, Sterling Hall felt less like a fortress and more like a home. Lucas Sterling was not a man fully changed. Not yet. But the crown of pride he had worn for so long was broken, and through its cracks something new was beginning to grow. Clara had stood, Maya had endured, and together they had forced him to see that power without compassion was nothing at all, and so the feast that had begun in humiliation ended in redemption. Not perfect, not final, but real. In the warmth of cornbread and greens, in the laughter of a child and the dignity of a maid, a different kind of legacy was being written. Not one of towers and contracts, but one of kindness, of courage, of love that could not be silenced. The gathering storm, the days following the infamous dinner at Sterling Hall, unfolded like the tightening coils of a storm, each moment heavy with an energy that promised eventual release. On the surface, life within the mansion resumed its polished rhythm, servants moving with quiet precision, silver-polished until it gleamed like mirrors. Lucas Sterling's schedule packed with meetings, phone calls, and terse instructions. But beneath the veneer of order, a fracture ran deep. Conversations between staff grew hushed. Guests who once flocked to Lucas's table began to hesitate, and within the walls of the home itself, the atmosphere was charged with unspoken tension. Maya moved through the halls with her usual grace, but her presence was no longer invisible. Servants who had once regarded her as simply another maid now looked at her with something more complicated, part pity, part admiration. They had all heard the stories whispered from that night, had seen the bruised cheek she tried to conceal, had noted the child clinging fiercely to her side in the days afterward. Within the servants' quarters, Maya became something she had never intended to be, a symbol. Not of defiance, perhaps, not yet, but of endurance, of dignity in the face of humiliation. It was a fragile power, one she carried carefully, aware that Lucas Sterling's eyes were everywhere. Clara, meanwhile, grew restless in her lessons. Her governess droned on about history, etiquette, and languages, but Clara's thoughts wandered. She found herself replaying the moment she had stood against her father, the moment she had refused to sit down. The fear still lingered, fear of his rage, fear of what consequences might follow, but alongside it was a swelling pride. She had looked into her father's eyes and refused to bend, and in doing so she had seen clearly that kindness mattered more than the marble halls and crystal chandeliers he prized so dearly. She began to ask questions in her lessons that unsettled her tutors. What good is wealth if it makes people cruel? Why do powerful men believe they are better than others? The governess, flustered, tried to redirect her to safer subjects, but the flame was already lit. Clara was no longer content to be molded quietly. Lucas noticed the changes. He was not a man easily deceived by appearances, and though Clara still attended her lessons and appeared at meals, he could see the distance growing between them. She avoided his gaze, answered his questions with curt nods, and when she looked at Maya, her expression softened in a way that twisted like a knife in his chest. He told himself he was losing his daughter to manipulation, that the maid had woven her way into Clara's affections with stories and meals. But deep down, Lucas knew the truth was more dangerous. Clara had seen him clearly, perhaps more clearly than anyone else ever had. In his world of skyscrapers and billion-dollar contracts, Lucas had always thrived on the certainty of power, yet after that dinner, whispers had begun to circulate. At a private club downtown, where politicians and magnates gathered in cigar smoke and leather armchairs, the subject arose. "Sterling's losing his grip," one senator remarked. "Can't even control his own house." Another chuckled, recalling the slap, the fall, the child's defiance. "Spectacle of the season. Shows what happens when pride gets sloppy." The words spread quietly but steadily, and Lucas, though outwardly dismissive, felt the sting. He had not built an empire to be mocked. His pride demanded action. Maya sensed his simmering rage, though he kept his words to a minimum when she was near. She worked carefully, fulfilling her duties, never speaking unless spoken to, but within her silence lay calculation. She had begun writing at night, small notes she tucked away in the pages of an old book, a record of what she had witnessed, of what Clara had endured, of what Lucas had done. It was not yet a weapon, but it was preparation. Her grandmother had taught her that memory could be a shield, and Maya was determined to ensure that the truth would not be erased, no matter how powerful the man who tried. One evening, a new dinner was held, smaller than the grand feast of before, but no less important. Investors from abroad, a senator and his wife, and a wealthy philanthropist were seated at Lucas's table. The food, though prepared by a replacement chef, lacked the warmth and soul Maya had brought, and Clara, seated quietly beside her father, pushed the food around her plate without enthusiasm. The guests noticed the tension. They noticed the way Lucas's daughter avoided his gaze, the way her smile appeared only when Maya entered to pour wine or clear plates. And though no one spoke openly, their eyes exchanged knowing glances. Power was not only about money, it was about perception. And perception was slipping through Lucas's hands. Clara, unable to contain her frustration, spoke during the meal in a voice louder than necessary. "I miss Maya's cooking." It tasted like someone cared. The room fell into silence. Lucas's jaw clenched. The senator coughed into his napkin, and his wife glanced sharply at her plate. But the words hung there, undeniable. The investors shifted, polite but curious, their expressions betraying the thought that perhaps the Sterling legacy was not as polished as they had believed. After the dinner, Lucas cornered Maya in the corridor. His voice was low, his expression deadly calm, but his eyes burned with rage. You will stay away from her. You will do your work in silence. If you dare to fill her head with more nonsense, I will make sure you regret ever stepping into this house. His words were a knife wrapped in velvet, quiet but cutting. Maya lowered her gaze, nodded slightly, and said nothing. But inside, her resolve only hardened. She had survived men like him before, and she would again. Later that night, Clara found her in the kitchen, tears of anger in her eyes. "He threatened you, didn't he?" she whispered. Maya placed a gentle finger to her lips. "Hush, child. Some battles are not fought with shouting. Sometimes silence gathers strength." Clara shook her head fiercely. "Then I'll shout for both of us." It was a dangerous promise, but Maya saw in Clara's eyes that it was no empty one. The storm within the house was no longer just between master and maid. It was spreading, touching investors, guests, servants, and above all, a daughter who refused to be molded into her father's shadow. And so, the storm gathered. The walls of Sterling Hall, polished and proud, could not silence the murmurs that grew louder with each passing day. Power, once unquestioned, was beginning to tremble, and in the kitchen, with each loaf of bread, each pot of greens, each recipe whispered from her grandmother's memory, Maya fed more than bodies. She fed hope, and hope once kindled is the most dangerous fire of all. The man with the broken crown, the night after the disastrous dinner, seemed to stretch longer than most nights in Sterling Hall. Outside, the gardens were drenched in moonlight, shadows of the fountains and hedges stretching across the manicured lawns like dark fingers clawing at the earth. The house itself, with its countless rooms and corridors, stood as a monument to wealth, but within its walls the silence was heavy, fractured only by the creak of old wood and the distant hum of the city beyond the gates. For Lucas Sterling, however, there was no peace to be found in the sprawling mansion he had built to declare his victory over the world. He sat alone in his study, the glow of a single lamp casting his shadow long against the walls lined with books he rarely opened. His hands wrapped around a glass of scotch that did nothing to quiet the rage inside him. The study was his sanctuary, a place where even servants were forbidden to enter without permission. Every piece of furniture was chosen for power rather than comfort. The heavy oak desk, the leather chairs that smelled faintly of tobacco, the portraits of men who had conquered industries and nations. Yet tonight the room felt less like a sanctuary and more like a prison. The memory of Clara standing against him, of Maya's calm defiance, replayed in his mind with each tick of the clock. He had always demanded obedience, and obedience had always been given, by investors, by rivals forced to bend under his negotiations, by employees too afraid to challenge him. But now, in front of men whose respect he needed, he had been made to look weak, undone by a maid and a child. Lucas lifted the scotch to his lips, swallowing the burn, but it did nothing to ease the deeper ache, the one that went back further than tonight's dinner. He told himself he despised weakness, that the world belonged only to those willing to crush or be crushed. But the truth he never allowed himself to voice, was that he had learned that lesson not out of strength but out of fear. He had not been born into marble halls or silver spoons. Lucas Sterling's first memories were not of chandeliers but of hunger. As a boy, he had lived in a cramped apartment with peeling wallpaper and a father who swung between sullen silence and drunken rages. His mother, weary and thin, stretched what little they had, often going without food so that Lucas could eat. He remembered the shame of second-hand clothes, the taunts of richer children at school, the nights he lay awake listening to his parents fight. The day his father walked out, slamming the door with the promise never to return, Lucas had been only 10. That was the day he decided he would never be powerless again, never hungry, never at the mercy of anyone else's cruelty. But resolve born of pain often hardens into stone. Lucas clawed his way upward, working double shifts, hustling through college, making ruthless deals that others called reckless, but that always seemed to pay off. When rivals stumbled, he stepped over them without remorse. When employees failed, he replaced them with colder efficiency than any machine. And when he married Clara's mother, it was not for love but for alliance, her family name opening doors that even his fortune could not. He had built an empire, yes, but he had built it on a foundation of anger, on the need to prove to a world that once mocked him that he was untouchable, and yet tonight had shown him otherwise. For all his towers of steel and glass, for all his billions and his influence, he had been defied by a maid with blood at her lip, and a daughter who saw through the armor he had forged. Lucas slammed the empty glass onto the desk, the sound sharp in the silence. He told himself it was Maya's fault, that she had poisoned Clara's mind with her soft words and her peasant recipes, that she had stepped out of her place and dared to challenge the order of his house. But beneath the anger was something more dangerous, the echo of Clara's voice, trembling but true, calling him unkind. He had built his life on the belief that kindness was weakness, that love was a liability, and yet his daughter, his only heir, looked at him not with admiration but with disappointment. That wound cut deeper than he cared to admit. It was not just rebellion, it was a reflection, showing him the man he had become. For a moment his gaze drifted to the photograph on his desk, the only one in the study not chosen for image but for sentiment. It was of Clara as a toddler, grinning with frosting on her cheeks after a birthday cake her mother had baked. In that photo she had looked at him with pure joy, her small arms reaching for him as though he were her entire world. He clenched his jaw and turned the photo face down. That was a long time ago. Elsewhere in the house, Maya sat by Clara's bedside, the child curled against her, too restless to sleep. The bedroom, adorned with lace curtains and shelves of books and dolls, was meant to be a haven, yet tonight it felt fragile, like a place caught between innocence and the weight of truths too heavy for a girl of 12. Clara clung to Maya's hand, her voice small in the dark. "Why is he like that?" she asked, her words trembling with both fear and confusion. Maya stroked the girl's hair gently, her own thoughts heavy. She could not explain all of Lucas Sterling's demons, nor could she soften the blow of what Clara had witnessed. Yet she would not lie either. "Sometimes," she said slowly, "people build walls so high to protect themselves that they forget those walls hurt the people around them. They think being strong means never showing kindness. But real strength, Clara, is in caring even when it costs you something." Clara sniffled, her small fingers tightening around Maya's. "He doesn't care about me," she whispered. "Not really." Maya's chest ached. She wanted to tell the child otherwise, to assure her that beneath Lucas's fury was love, however twisted by fear and pride. But the truth was harder, and Maya had always believed children deserved truth. "He cares in his way," she said softly. "But sometimes people confuse control with love, and that isn't fair to you." Clara was quiet for a long moment, her breath uneven. Finally, she whispered, "Then I'll care enough for both of us." Her words, fragile but fierce, carried the same fire she had shown at the dinner table. Maya held her close, her heart swelling with both sorrow and pride. In this house of marble and cruelty, this child was a flame, small but unyielding. Back in his study, Lucas stared into the dark, the city lights glittering beyond the window like stars he could never touch. He told himself tomorrow he would restore order, crush dissent, remind both maid and daughter of their places. But even as he plotted, a crack had formed in the crown he wore so proudly. He was not untouchable. He was not adored. He was a man who had everything and yet risked losing the one thing he could never buy back, his daughter's trust. And far below, in the quiet of the servants' quarters, Maya sat awake long after Clara had drifted into uneasy dreams. She replayed the night in her mind, the sting of the slap, the cruel laughter of the guests, the cold fire in Lucas's eyes. She had not come to Sterling Hall to fight battles, but she could feel the tide shifting. The world was watching Lucas Sterling, and the cracks in his empire were beginning to show. Somewhere deep in her heart, she knew that her role in this house was no longer to remain invisible. A storm was gathering, and she would be part of it, not as a victim but as a witness, and when the time came, as a voice that could no longer be silenced. The Daughters' Stand. The morning after the infamous dinner broke with a sky painted in muted shades of gray, as though even the sun hesitated to cast its warmth upon Sterling Hall. Dew clung to the manicured hedges, the fountains murmured faintly, but inside the mansion the air was tense, brittle, carrying the echoes of words and actions that could not be undone. Clara awoke with heavy eyes, the memory of her father's fury pressing down on her chest like a weight. She lay still for a moment, staring at the carved ceiling of her bedroom, and wondered whether courage always felt so exhausting. Yet beneath the exhaustion was something new, something she could not ignore. Resolve. She dressed in silence, her small hands fumbling with the buttons of her blouse, and when Maya entered to check on her, Clara rushed into her arms. The embrace was wordless, but in that moment the girl knew what she had already begun to accept. Maya was not simply the maid. She was the anchor, the presence of kindness in a home where coldness reigned. Maya stroked the child's hair gently, her eyes searching Clara's face. "You were very brave last night," she whispered. Clara looked up at her, lips trembling but eyes alight. It didn't feel brave. It just felt right. Those words lingered with Maya long after Clara had gone to her lessons. In her heart, she knew the child had spoken a truth that adults so often forgot. Bravery was rarely the absence of fear. It was the act of choosing what was right in spite of fear, and Clara, at 12, had chosen to stand when the rest of the hall had sat silent. It was a choice that could not easily be undone. Lucas Sterling, however, had spent the morning in seclusion. His staff moved around him carefully as though navigating a predator's cage. He was not a man who tolerated disobedience, and last night's events had been a public humiliation he could not easily forgive. In the boardrooms of the city, power was as much about perception as reality, and Lucas knew his guests would carry whispers of that dinner into every circle that mattered. The titan who could silence senators had been silenced in his own dining room by a maid and his own daughter. It was an insult that burned deeper than any failed deal. Yet Lucas also knew his empire could not afford more cracks. His fortune was vast, but it was tied to investors, to politics, to alliances fragile as glass. He could not afford scandal, and so he plotted in silence, sipping black coffee in his study, deciding how he would reassert control without drawing further attention. His anger toward Maya was sharp, but it was Clara who troubled him most. The girl he had assumed would grow into a polished reflection of himself had revealed a spirit he did not recognize, one that rejected his lessons of dominance. He told himself she was too young to understand, that she had been manipulated by the maid's soft words. But in his heart, a quieter fear whispered, what if she had simply seen the truth? That afternoon, Clara was summoned to the garden terrace where her father awaited her. She approached cautiously, her small shoes crunching on the gravel, her gaze fixed on the towering figure who stood with his hands behind his back, staring out over the fountains as though they were subjects awaiting his decree. When he finally turned, his expression was calm, almost too calm, the kind of composure that made Clara's stomach twist. "Clara," he began, his tone smooth but cold, "we need to speak about last night." Her heart pounded, but she lifted her chin. "I don't want you to hurt Maya again." His jaw tightened. "You will not tell me what I may or may not do in my own house." "She didn't do anything wrong," Clara insisted, her voice wavering but refusing to break. "You hurt her for no reason, and you embarrassed yourself." The words struck like arrows, piercing through the polished armor he wore. Lucas inhaled sharply, his composure cracking for the briefest moment. No one, not even business rivals, had dared speak to him in such a way. To hear it from his own daughter unsettled him more than he cared to admit. "You are a child," he said at last, his voice low, dangerous. "Children do not understand the ways of the world. Obedience is not optional, it is survival." Clara's small hands balled into fists at her sides. "Then I don't want your world." The silence that followed was so sharp it seemed to cut through the air. Lucas stared at her, stunned. For the first time he saw not a child but a young girl whose spirit would not be molded into his image. It was like looking into a mirror that reflected not himself but his opposite. Her fire where he was stone, her compassion where he was cruelty. He wanted to shout, to shake her into submission, but something in her gaze held him still. Maya, though not present, felt the reverberations of that conversation later that evening when Clara slipped into the servants' quarters. Her face pale but her eyes alight. "I told him I don't want his world," she whispered, as though confessing a sin and a triumph in the same breath. Maya knelt to meet her gaze, her heart swelling with pride and sorrow. "That was very brave," she murmured. "But bravery has consequences, Clara. He will not let this go easily." Clara nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "I don't care. I won't let him make me like him." Those words, spoken in the quiet of the servants' wing, were more than rebellion. They were the beginning of a new path, one that would shape not only Clara's future but Maya's as well. For in Clara's defiance, Maya saw a chance to challenge more than the cruelty of one man. She saw the possibility of shifting the balance within a house and perhaps in time beyond it. That night, Lucas dined alone in the vast hall that only hours before had been filled with laughter and cruelty. The plates were set, the silver polished, but the room felt hollow, the silence deafening. He cut into his steak with mechanical precision, but each bite was tasteless, swallowed with scotch that failed to burn away the memory of his daughter's words. "I don't want your world." They echoed through him like a curse, stripping away the illusion that he had built not only towers but legacy. For what was legacy if his own blood rejected it? In the kitchens below, Maya prepared simple meals for the staff, her hands steady even as her thoughts raced. She knew Lucas Sterling would strike again, not with fists perhaps, but with the kind of calculated cruelty that left scars unseen. She had lived her life enduring such men, but never before had she been positioned so precariously, not only for her own sake, but for the child who now clung to her with a trust that was dangerous and precious. She whispered a prayer as she kneaded dough, the words of her grandmother echoing in her heart. Strength is not in the fist, but in the hand that feeds, and in Sterling Hall, strength was being redefined, not by the man who sat alone in his hollow empire, but by a child who dared to stand and a woman who refused to kneel. The breaking point. The storm that had been gathering within the walls of Sterling Hall did not arrive suddenly with thunderclaps and lightning strikes. It came with a slow, suffocating heaviness that settled over every corridor, every room, and every heart within the mansion. Servants moved with an almost exaggerated quietness, as though the sound of their footsteps might provoke an outburst. Guests who once sought Lucas Sterling's table with eagerness began to invent excuses, their letters of polite regret filled with veiled evasions. Even the great hall, once a theater of opulence, seemed colder, its chandeliers less brilliant, its walls echoing with the memory of that night when pride and cruelty had been witnessed by too many eyes. Lucas himself carried the weight of it like a storm cloud over his shoulders, his temper shortening, his commands sharper, his solitude darker. He began to work later into the night, locking himself in his study with files, reports, and glasses of whiskey that grew emptier by the hour. His empire, still vast and powerful, was not yet crumbling in the financial sense, but Lucas had lived long enough in the circles of the powerful to recognize the tremors before collapse. Investors who once clasped his hand with eagerness now studied him with subtle wariness. Allies who had praised his control now whispered of volatility. He heard it in their silences, in the pauses during meetings, in the way their eyes shifted when his daughter entered the room with Maya close by. Power, he knew, depended on fear and admiration in equal measure, and both were slipping from his grasp. Maya, meanwhile, had begun to feel the change more deeply than she had anticipated. She had intended only to endure, to cook, to clean, to gather evidence quietly, but she could not ignore the way her presence had begun to inspire. The servants now came to her in secret, sharing their stories of mistreatment, their whispered dreams of lives beyond the mansion's gilded walls. They asked her for advice, leaned on her for comfort, and though she warned them to remain cautious, she could not help but feel the stirrings of something larger than herself. Each night she added to her secret writings, recording not only the events she had witnessed but also the small acts of courage she saw in others. It was a chronicle of truth, one that might one day matter more than she could yet imagine. Clara, however, was the true flame that refused to be extinguished. Each day she grew bolder, her questions sharper, her defiance more pronounced. Where once she had moved quietly to avoid her father's notice, now she met his gaze without flinching, her small body carrying a strength that unsettled even him. When Lucas scolded her for speaking kindly to the staff, she answered with pointed questions. Why shouldn't I treat people the way I wish to be treated? When he forbade her from entering the kitchens, she slipped down the stairs anyway, carrying her books and sitting by Maya while she worked, her laughter filling the room with a warmth the mansion had not known in years. The breaking point arrived not in some grand confrontation before investors or senators, but in a quieter moment, when the three of them, father, daughter, and maid, were forced together in the same room once more. Lucas had called for Clara to join him in the library, determined to speak sense into her, to reassert the authority he believed he was owed. Maya, summoned to deliver refreshments, entered quietly, intending to leave quickly, but Clara would not let her go. The girl sat beside her father, her spine straight, her eyes unflinching, while Maya lingered uncertainly near the door. Clara, Lucas began, his voice deceptively calm. You must understand that this rebellion of yours cannot continue. You embarrass yourself, you embarrass this family, and you undermine everything I have built. Clara's voice was steady, though her hands trembled slightly in her lap. "I don't want what you've built. Not if it means hurting people." His jaw tightened. "You are a child. You don't understand the world. It is built on strength, on control. Without it, you are nothing." "Then I'd rather be nothing," she answered, her words cutting through the heavy silence like a blade. "Better nothing than cruel." The words struck him harder than any rival's insult, harder than any financial blow. For a moment, Lucas could not speak. His daughter's rejection was not just rebellion. It was condemnation. He felt the weight of his life pressing down on him. The empire he had built suddenly hollow when measured against the gaze of the one person whose admiration had once mattered most. His hand trembled. Whether from rage or despair, even he could not tell. Maya, sensing the danger, stepped forward cautiously. "Sir," she said softly, "she speaks only from her heart. Do not punish her for seeing the truth." Lucas turned on her then, his eyes blazing. "You," he spat. "This is your doing. You have poisoned her against me, filled her head with nonsense, turned her into something weak." He took a step toward her, his shadow falling across the room, but this time, Maya did not retreat. She stood tall, her face calm though her heart raced, and met his fury with quiet strength. "I have done nothing but care for her," she replied, her voice firm but gentle. "If that is poison, then perhaps the sickness is not in me." The silence that followed was unbearable, thick with the weight of words that could not be unsaid. Clara stood then, stepping between them, her small frame trembling but unyielding. "Don't hurt her again," she said, her voice rising with a strength beyond her years. "If you do, you'll lose me forever." Those words, more than anything else, marked the breaking point. Lucas stared at his daughter, his chest rising and falling with the force of his breath, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. He had faced boardroom battles, legal wars, and hostile takeovers, but never had he faced the simple, unshakable truth of a child's love refusing to bend. And in that moment, something within him cracked, not the empire, not the fortune, but the man himself. He turned away abruptly, his voice hoarse. "Leave me." Maya took Clara's hand, guiding her from the room, her own heart heavy with the knowledge that this was not the end, but only the beginning of what was to come. Lucas Sterling was a man unraveling, and men like him did not fall quietly. The storm had broken, and the house that once seemed so unshakable now stood on the edge of collapse. That night, as Clara lay curled beside her in the servants' quarters, Maya whispered a vow into the dark. She would protect this child no matter the cost. And though fear still coiled within her, another truth had taken root. The power of cruelty was great, but the power of compassion once kindled was unstoppable. And within Sterling Hall, compassion had found its voice. The fire in the kitchen, the silence that followed Clara's defiance was unlike anything Sterling Hall had ever known. It was not the hush of admiration or the pause before polite applause. It was the brittle quiet of scandal, of boundaries crossed that could not be uncrossed. The chandelier seemed dimmer, the crystal glasses heavier, as if even the air hesitated to move. Lucas Sterling's empire had been built on control of markets, of cities, of men's ambitions, and here, in the grand hall of his own home, his control was cracking, not under the weight of competitors or financial ruin, but because of a girl of 12 and a maid who refused to crumble. Clara's arms around Maya's waist were not just an embrace. They were a declaration, a visible rebellion that stripped away Lucas's authority before the eyes of those who had come to witness his power. Maya, standing with the child pressed against her, felt the burn of her swollen cheek, the taste of blood at the corner of her lip, and yet something within her had settled. For so long she had trained herself to be invisible, to slip through hallways and into kitchens without notice, to live as though her presence could be erased at any moment without consequence. But Clara's defiance had dragged her into the center of the storm. She no longer had the luxury of silence. Even if her lips remained closed, her existence, her dignity, her refusal to kneel on the marble floor had spoken. And though fear coiled in her stomach like a tightened rope, another force was rising within her, the weight of memory. When Maya was a child herself, barely older than Clara, her grandmother had taught her the rituals of the kitchen. "Food is not just food," her grandmother used to say, kneading dough with hands cracked from years of labor. "It is memory. It is love you can taste. It is survival, even when the world tries to take everything else." During storms, when houses were flooded and streets turned to rivers, Her grandmother would gather neighbors into their small kitchen. With little more than flour, lard, beans, and determination, she created meals that filled not only bellies but spirits. Maya remembered the lines of tired faces at their door, the way laughter returned to children after a single bite of warm cornbread. That memory had carried her through every humiliation she had endured as a maid. Now in Sterling Hall that fire returned. She straightened her spine, rested a hand on Clara's small shoulder, and looked not at Lucas Sterling but at the silent gallery of guests who had borne witness to his strike. Their expressions told a story, some smug, some appalled, some restless with the hunger for gossip they would carry beyond these walls. Yet beneath it all was their complicity. They had watched a man strike a woman, had watched laughter ripple at her fall, and still they sat, comfortable in their silks and jewels. It was the same world Maya had grown up in, where suffering was entertainment as long as it did not touch the privileged. Lucas's voice finally broke the silence, rough with fury, barely restrained. "You'll regret this disobedience," he muttered, his gaze searing into his daughter's pale face. Clara did not flinch. The girl's small body trembled, but her chin jutted forward with a courage far beyond her years. "I won't let you hurt her again," she said, her voice quivering but steady enough to slice through the silence. She didn't do anything wrong. The words, fragile yet fierce, carried more weight than the rehearsed speeches of senators at the table. The guests stirred, shifting uncomfortably. A senator's wife sipped her champagne with a forced smile, whispering to her neighbor, "This is turning into quite the spectacle." Another guest, less polite, muttered, "Children today, no respect for authority." Yet in their eyes was something more dangerous than disdain, calculation. They were watching not only a father and daughter, but a man whose empire was built on reputation. They would carry this scene into their boardrooms, their fundraisers, their whispered conversations over cigars. They would remember Lucas Sterling not as the untouchable titan, but as a man who lost control of his own household. Lucas seemed to sense it too. His jaw tightened, his nostrils flared, and for a moment his hand twitched at his side, as though he longed to raise it again. But he stopped himself. Instead, he exhaled sharply, straightened his jacket, and declared, "Dinner is over. My staff will see you out." His voice was like iron, final and cutting. Chairs scraped against the marble as the guests rose, their murmurs buzzing like hornets. Some offered stiff nods to their host. Others smirked at Maya as they passed, their eyes gleaming with cruel amusement. One man, tall with a diamond pin at his tie, leaned close as he brushed by her. "Best keep your head down, girl," he whispered, his voice low and cold. "Not everyone here is as forgiving as he is. Forgiving." The word lodged in Maya's chest like a shard of glass. She swallowed it down and said nothing, though her heart hammered in her ears. When the last guest filed out, the hall seemed larger, emptier. The chandelier's glow no longer gilded with splendor, but harsh and sterile. Only Lucas, Clara, and Maya remained, locked in a triangle of silence that pulsed with unspoken words. "Go to your room," Lucas finally commanded, his tone low, dangerous. Clara hesitated, then shook her head, her eyes glistening with tears she refused to shed. "I'm not leaving her," she said. Lucas's hand twitched again, his temper a beast barely leashed. He inhaled deeply, his chest rising, and exhaled in a growl. "You'll regret this." Maya stepped forward then, her hand protective on Clara's shoulder, her own voice calm but unwavering. "She's only speaking her heart," she said. "Don't punish her for loving someone, Mr. Sterling." The words hit like stones tossed into still water, sending ripples across the silence. Lucas's eyes narrowed, his fury dark as storm clouds, but beneath it was something else, something he buried quickly beneath his scowl. He turned away abruptly, his voice sharp. "Out of my sight. Both of you." Maya bowed her head slightly, guiding Clara from the hall. Her cheek throbbed, her knees ached from the fall, but she walked tall, each step a quiet defiance. In her heart, she carried the memory of her grandmother's kitchen, the fire of survival that had never gone out. And though she said nothing aloud, a silent vow formed within her. This was not the end. Tonight had been humiliation, but it had also been revelation. The truth of Lucas Sterling's cruelty had been witnessed. His empire of fear cracked before the eyes of his own child. In the quiet corridors of Sterling Hall, as she guided Clara toward the safety of her room, Maya's resolve burned brighter. She would endure, she would remember, and when the time came, she would rise. The silent feast. The chandelier above the dining hall glowed like a crown of fire, spilling light onto polished marble, silverware so bright it seemed to hum, and wine glasses that caught every flicker of flame like liquid rubies. The air was heavy with perfumes, cigar smoke, and the faint tang of roasted meat carried from the kitchens. Sterling Hall was alive with murmurs, a grand theater of wealth and influence where every guest understood their role. They had gathered to dine not just for food but for power. Alliances whispered over crystal and carved lamb. At the head of the table sat Lucas Sterling, billionaire, titan of glass and steel. To the world he was a monument of success, a man who carved his name into skylines. Tonight he wore his authority like armor, broad shoulders framed by a tailored jacket, his gaze cold, his presence commanding silence, even when he did not speak. Around him, senators, oil magnates, and tycoons leaned toward one another with the arrogance of people who believed their opinions shaped the tides of nations. But in the far corner of the hall, barely noticed, stood Maya Williams. She was not meant to be here. Not in this room where chandeliers glittered like constellations and fortunes whispered themselves into existence. Maya was a maid, invisible by design, someone who polished floors and collected dishes after the feast was done. But tonight had not gone to plan. 2 hours before service, the famed head chef Raldi had collapsed, clutching his stomach with a groan of pain. Food poisoning. The staff had panicked, scurrying like ants as the clock ticked toward the most important dinner of the season. Senators, billionaires, international investors, they would not forgive a ruined evening. In the scramble, the butler's sharp eyes had landed on Maya. She should have refused. She should have bowed her head, excused herself, reminded them she was only hired to dust and mop. But when the butler thrust the apron into her hands and snapped, "You're the only one who knows Raldi's recipes well enough. Do it, or we're finished." Something inside her had tightened. She thought of the nights her grandmother had taught her to coax miracles out of beans and cornbread, the times neighbors had survived on her family's food when storms swept through their street. Cooking to Maya was not just work. It was memory. It was love carried on smoke and salt, and so she had stepped into the kitchen. Now she carried the last tray forward, heart steady but heavy. Platters of braised greens, golden cornbread, and smoked turkey, the aromas rich and layered, settled onto the table before the guests. For a brief moment, Maya allowed herself a breath. The plates had been filled, the service complete. The guests would eat, and perhaps they would not notice who had cooked. Then Lucas Sterling spoke. The sound of his voice cracked across the hall like a whip. "The smell," he said, leaning back in his chair. His nostrils flared, his lip curled in disdain. His gaze locked onto Maya as though she were an insect crawling across his mahogany table. "Don't tell me those filthy hands of yours cooked this for me." The room stilled. Forks hovered above plates. A senator's glass froze halfway to his lips. Even the candles seemed to flicker more cautiously, as though afraid of being extinguished. Maya's chest tightened, but she did not move. She had endured insults before, whispers in corridors, mutters in markets. But here in front of so many eyes, the words pierced deeper. Her grandmother's recipes sat steaming on the plates, and already they had been called unclean. A woman with diamonds dripping at her throat gave a sharp laugh. "Well," she said, "I thought Sterling Hall had standards." Another voice, a senator, heavy with mockery. "Guess we're getting a taste of the ghetto tonight." Laughter rippled down the table, cruel and easy. Maya inhaled slowly. "1, 2, 3, she steadied her voice. "Sir," she said softly, "it's cornbread and braised greens with smoked turkey. A recipe from my grandmother. It is fed. I don't care what dead relative taught you." Lucas cut her off, his hand slamming onto the table with such force the glasses trembled. His eyes burned cold. "You're here to serve, not contaminate my table with your back alley recipes." The oil man to his left chuckled, swirling bourbon in a thick glass. "Guess we'll see if it kills us or not." More laughter. Maya's fingers clenched against the tray, her knuckles white. Her cheek flushed hot, but her voice did not rise. "This meal has nourished families for generations, sir. During floods, during shortages, my mother's—" "Then let it be buried with her." The words struck harder than a blow. Gasps fluttered from the guests, though some smiled, entertained by the cruelty. It was then that a smaller voice broke through the storm. "Why does it matter who made the food, Dad?" The hall fell silent. At the far side of the table, Clara Sterling, just 12 years old, had risen to her feet. Her small fists were clenched at her sides, her chin tilted up with defiance. Her golden hair shimmered in the chandelier's light, but her eyes burned with something no guest had ever seen in Lucas Sterling's daughter. Fire. Sit down, Lucas snapped. No, Clara said. Her voice trembled, but she did not falter. She's kind. She cooks for me. She tells me stories. You're the one being... Lucas's glare could have carved stone. You're a child. Children don't understand cleanliness. Maya turned her face slightly away. Her expression stayed calm, but inside a storm rose. She had not come here to start wars. She had come to survive, to endure, to remember. Still, the cruelty pressed down on her chest like a weight of iron. Enough, Lucas roared, his voice echoing against marble walls. He jabbed a finger at Maya. Look at what you've done. You've filled her head with poison. Turned her against me. Maya lowered the tray. Her voice was gentle, almost breaking, but held firm. I've only cared for her, Mr. Sterling. The chair screeched as Lucas rose to his feet, towering above her. Don't you talk back to me in my house. The slap came before anyone could blink. The crack of his palm against her cheek echoed through the hall. Maya staggered back, the tray tilting, bowls sliding. One shattered against the marble, broth splashing across her apron. Blood pricked her lip where his ring had caught her skin. The guests gasped, some covering their mouths, others smirking in cruel satisfaction. Maya bent slowly, trembling, to gather the broken pieces. But before her hands could close around the shards, a polished shoe slid out beneath the table and hooked her ankle. She fell hard, her knees striking marble, the sting sharp and cruel. Laughter bubbled from the far end of the hall. For a moment she stayed there, on her knees, palms pressed to the cold stone. And in that moment a smell rose above the shame and the pain. Cornbread baking in her grandmother's iron skillet. Smoke, salt, warmth. A kitchen after the hurricane when neighbors lined up outside with empty bellies and tired eyes. Her mother cooking all night with nothing but donated flour and faith. That meal had carried them through until help came. That meal had kept them alive. Maya blinked, shuddered, and pushed herself back to her feet. She would not stay on the floor, not here, not before them, and then... Clara moved. The girl broke from her chair and ran to Maya, small arms wrapping fiercely around her waist. I'm sorry, she whispered, tears wetting her voice. I'm so sorry. Lucas's face hardened, jaw a block of granite. Get away from her, Clara. No, Clara's arms tightened. Her chin lifted, fierce in her trembling. The chandelier glittered above, but its light had grown cold. Around the table, silence stretched taut, heavy, waiting for what would come next.